Safety question for you. Do you think it makes any sense at all, common sense here being the determining factor, that in some states an 18-year-old is allowed to buy an assault rifle but is not allowed to buy a handgun?
You know, look, I think different states have different laws, and I think actually that question, if you want to ask common sense, what we ought to be asking is what actually stops violent crime. You know, back in the 1990s under Bill Clinton, we had a so-called assault rifle ban that was in effect for a number of years. Then it expired. The Department of Justice studied that so-called ban, found it had no statistically significant effect on violent crime. It's a great Democratic talking point. And part of the reason is an assault rifle. It's not a machine gun. Machine guns are already functionally illegal. They have been for over 80 years. What they call an assault weapon is essentially a scary-looking gun with a plastic handle here, a strap there. Doesn't make it any more dangerous. If you want to stop crime...
Well, wait. The studies, even Pentagon studies, show that weapons like the AR-15 actually are designed to be more lethal. And there were actually, and I've talked about the article a good bit, there was an article in the Atlantic in 1981 where actually they did an after-action report, and there was criticism that a gun much like the AR-15 wasn't used in Vietnam because it was lighter, it was more lethal, and it was more of a killing machine than the guns that our soldiers were using in Vietnam. So it is designed to kill more effectively, more efficiently.
Joe, the firing mechanisms, the lethality of an AR-15 is indistinguishable from many deer rifles. When we were having this debate in 2013, Dianne Feinstein proposed her so-called assault weapons ban. I put up a picture of one of the most common deer rifles in America, owned by millions of Americans. Under the statute she introduced, that was not a, quote, assault rifle. And then I held up a $5.99 little plastic handle. If you attach the plastic handle to it, suddenly it was a banned assault weapon.
So your argument here is that deer rifles are just as lethal. If somebody takes
the firing mechanism is functionally the same. If somebody
takes a deer rifle into a high school in Parkland, that deer rifle is going to be as lethal as an AR-15?
So, Joe, my argument is twofold. Number one, going after the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, it doesn't work. It was actually the Bill Clinton Justice Department that concluded that the assault weapons ban had zero statistical impact.
Better than anybody, and I don't want to. I mean, we don't want to get into a sort of a moot court argument here, but you know better than anyone what the Second Amendment says and what it does.
I don't know about better than anyone, but I know what the Second Amendment says.
But you were involved with Heller, weren't you? You were involved with
represented 31 states in Heller.
And so you know that at least where it stands right now, Scalia said that the Second Amendment means that people have a right to keep and bear arms in their homes. They have a right to have handguns in their home. They have a right to have shotguns in their home.
He didn't just say in their home, by the way. The home is not a qualifier.
But if you go from 2008 and the decision in 2010 all the way through now, obviously the Supreme Court has denied cert time and time again for limitations on assault-style weapons, for limitations on carry, for limitations on just about everything but what you and others successfully argued in Heller. So having an
Remember, Heller was about a semi-automatic handgun, which the Supreme Court said the Second Amendment protected and the District of Columbia couldn't ban.
But you know, though, that every American doesn't have a constitutional Second Amendment right to carry an AR-15.
Let me answer.
Yes or no?
I'm not going to debate that. The courts, the courts will assess it.
But the courts have assessed it.
No, they haven't. That's not what a denial of cert means. The court often, on an area of constitutional litigation, will let the federal courts of appeals, they call it percolating, which is to let them debate it back and forth. And a denial of cert has no presidential impact.
Senator, there are a lot of people, lawyers right now, that are rolling their eyes at what you're saying because this percolation has been going on for 10 years.
That's not unusual. And remember, my career was litigating before the Supreme Court. So actually, this is not an uncommon thing. I recognize that's not what you do, but the court denies cert.
Wait, I don't need you to lecture me on what the Supreme Court does and what it doesn't do. If the Supreme Court denies cert time and time again, and they have since 2010, and they've allowed Connecticut's laws to stand in place that actually ban assault-style weapons.
So
right now, the court is sitting back, and they are allowing that to remain in place and allowing that. That is constitutional right now. There is not a constitutional right, and you know it. And you can talk down to me all you want to, but you know there is not a constitutional...
Joe, who's talking down to whom? You say lawyers are rolling their eyes at me. I mean, let's just be clear.
Because you said this is what you do. I understand it's not what you do, Joe, but I do understand this. Even a dumb country lawyer like me understands that an AR-15 today is not recognized as a constitutional right of Americans under the Second Amendment. Is that right or wrong?
Actually, under the test that the Supreme Court laid out in Heller, whether an instrument of defense is in common and popular usage, the AR-15 is one of the most popular and common weapons in the United States. Under the test of Heller,
so
it is clearly protected.
You would think that the Supreme Court of the United States would actually accept one of these cases and say Joe, what you're saying. But you were talking about what you want the law to be.
No.
I'm talking about what the law is.
But the test Scalia laid out is whether it is popular. Is this a weapon that is commonly desired? What the Second Amendment says is the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The right of the people is a term of art the framers used for an individual right. And your point about denying cert, every year the court gets about 8,000 cert petitions. They grant cert in typically 70 to 80 cases. So typically 1% or fewer.
I understand.
And so it is black letter law that a denial of cert has no presidential value. But let me stop and make the more important point.
There is a constitutional right that is infringed upon, that by at least 4 members of the court, they will accept cert, and they will listen to that. Right now, there are not...
typically if there's not a circuit split. You're incorrect. The number one determinant on whether the court takes a case is there a circuit split? Are the courts of appeals sharply divided and unable to resolve it? So routinely...
I give you credit for swatting away what is reality, what is legal reality. But there is no...
Can I actually make the point that matters the most? Because this debate, if you want to stop violent crime, this debate is dancing on the head of a pin.
Okay, but
here's what stops violent crime.
But hold on, I may agree with you, Senator, but the one thing that I think that is important...
Well, then what am I going to say?
Is that the media gets the arguments around the Second Amendment wrong a lot of time. But so do a lot of politicians that go out and say, I have a God-given Second Amendment right to carry around an AR-15, when that is not the law of the land right now. But go ahead and make your point.
Yeah, let me give, Mike asked about common sense and practicality. Look, I've spent a lot of my life in law enforcement dealing with murderers and rapists and violent criminals. We need to stop these mass murders. Now, if you want to do it, what isn't effective is gun control. Many of the jurisdictions with the toughest gun control laws have among the worst crime rates and murder rates. What is effective is targeting violent criminals. Yesterday, I reintroduced legislation, Grassley-Cruz, which is legislation I introduced in 2013. It got voted on in the Senate. It got a majority vote in the Senate, including 9 Democrats, most bipartisan support of any of the comprehensive legislation. What did Grassley-Cruz do? Number one, it increased funding for school safety by $300 million. The Obama administration had cut that. If Grassley-Cruz had passed, if Harry Reid and the Democrats hadn't filibustered it, that could have meant that another armed police officer would have been at Parkland and could have intercepted this gunman before he murdered those teenagers. In addition to that, Sutherland Springs, my home state of Texas.
They had 4 or 5.
Sutherland Springs was the worst church shooting in history. Now, Joe, I stood in that sanctuary the day after that shooting. I stood with those families, held those families, cried with those families, prayed with those families. One of the most maddening things about Sutherland Springs, the shooter there, it was already illegal for him to possess a firearm, doubly so. He had a felony conviction, and he had a domestic violence conviction. So why did he have a firearm? He had a firearm because the Air Force under President Obama failed to report the conviction to the background database.
So what, do you support what Cornyn and Murphy are trying to pass right now?
I actually think that it has